Khabib and Islam are already considered to be a part of the top 3 lightweights to ever fight, with most people having the lightweight GOATs in some order of Khabib, Charles, and Islam. Despite there being a clear recency bias there, does anyone actually think BJ Penn, Frankie, or Conor have any argument over them? The only way you can really dispute this is if you want to set the parameters of the debate to the highest peak, in which most people would attempt to make the argument for Conor or Khabib. But regardless of that, with UFC 302 coming up soon, Islam is 1 win away from tying Khabib in title defenses, and we're going to be breaking down if with a win Islam would surpass Khabib and what Islam would need to do in order to become the undisputed lightweight GOAT. For starters, from a fighting perspective, it's generally considered that Khabib has the better cardio and the better fight IQ, whereas Islam has the far superior striking. And when it comes to wrestling, I don't think it takes a genius to see that they're around the same level. Now, I know Khabib fans would lose their mind whenever their GOAT is taken down a pedestal, but to say Islam doesn't have the better striking is pretty insane, especially if you take Islam's painful but impressive knockout over Volkanovski into account. Considering how the first fight went and how much striking there actually was in that fight, he also painfully knocked down Charles, which led to the submission that led to him winning the belt. So in terms of fighting styles and actual skills, I think it's hard to determine who's better without getting into resume, because the way Khabib was beating opponents looks totally different than how Islam is winning these fights. And honestly, being a professional couch coach myself, I feel like a bit of a clown trying to critique them in terms of technical fighting skills. So their resumes, and obviously the elephant in the room is Islam's knockout loss. Now, this happened before they fought relevant opponents. Islam was around 24 years old, and it was his second fight in the UFC. He got caught, knocked out cold. For more context, Adriano Martinez went on a 5-fight losing streak after that and is far from being a relevant fighter. I think in most situations, people won't hold this against Islam. A lot of great fighters have MMA losses early in their careers, like Usman, Conor, and Colby. And to say a loss means you can't be an all-time great is a pretty absurd statement once you take into consideration how early in his career this was. But I think the reason it's even brought up and debated is the fact that he's going up against Khabib, who has obviously never lost. So from that perspective, I can see why people bring it up. Undoubtedly, it does give Khabib a leg up over Islam, but I don't think it should be seen as the main selling point in any argument about which is better. But before we get deeper into the resumes, if you could leave a like on this video, I would really appreciate it, and let's get back to it. So what about when the two actually started fighting relevant contenders? Some of the big names Islam has had before his title shot is a young Arman, Drew Dober, Thiago Moises, Dan Hooker, and Bobby Green. That's a real murderer's row he got there. As for Khabib, we got RDA, Michael Johnson, and Edson Barboza. So pretty clearly, Khabib has the better of the two in terms of pre-title fight buildups. Before we continue though, the NBA conference finals are here, and my sponsor Underdog Fantasy wants to make them a lot more fun. Playing their pick'em game is as simple as selecting higher or lower on player stats like points, threes, and so much more. Make entries of all NBA picks or mix and match and include other sports. You can win up to 100 times your money. Underdog is available in 30 plus states, including California, Texas, and Canada. They also just launched Champions, their player versus player game in Florida. Here are my picks for the NBA games. New customers can pair that with Jason Tatum to score just 1 point. All Tatum has to do is score at least 1 point and you win that selection. So make sure you sign up with code Quiche to claim your special and deposit offer of up to $250 in bonus cash. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code Quiche. I mean, Edson Barboza back then was dangerous, was a striker on a caliber that Khabib had never fought before. The likes of Michael Johnson, someone that knocked out Dustin Poirier, and he's always been relevant. To then go to RDA, who was a UFC legend, comparing that to Islam's resume to that point, it's not even close. I understand for the most part, it's not Islam's fault because him versus Benil never ended up happening, but regardless, Khabib had the better resume to that point, so let's just jump into the championship fights. Khabib vs. Al compared to Islam vs. Charles is not even close. Islam fought Charles, who was on the brink of surpassing Khabib, and he knocked him down and subbed him in round 2, whereas Khabib went 5 rounds with a real estate agent. How does Khabib of all fighters not get Al Iaquinta out of there in 5 rounds? For that to go to a decision is insane, and I don't think anyone needs that much convincing that Islam clearly had the tougher fight. From there, you go to Khabib vs. Conor and Islam vs. Volk. This is where things get weird and dicey. You have Khabib fighting a Conor who had been out of the cage for over a year, but he had never lost at lightweight, and his last MMA fight was against Eddie, which is arguably the greatest performance in the history of the UFC. Where you compare that to Volkanovski, who had never lost in the UFC to that point. He was clearly the featherweight GOAT, and he was at his peak, but at the end of the day, he is a featherweight, and that fight was super close. And whenever I watch it, I score it differently, and just for that reason, I have to give it to Khabib because of how much of a hard time Islam had with Volk. And I understand Volk is seen as a superior fighter to Conor, but Conor back then was still seen as an elite fighter. His training camp may have been a disaster, but at the end of the day, Khabib was dominating that fight, and Islam had some moments where he was really hurt in that Volkanovski fight. Moving from there, you have Khabib versus Dustin and Islam versus Volk too. And it's pretty clear here that this goes to Islam. He literally had kicked one of the greatest fighters of all time into the shadow realm, and Khabib almost got submitted in that fight, and he ended up winning in round 3. Is way more of Islam doing something really impressive than Khabib doing something wrong. Dustin at that point in 2019 was still really legit and had some big names like Gaethje, Max, and Eddie Alvarez under his belt, but Islam literally knocked out Volk in round 1. That being said, it does get a little bit dicey because Volk did take this fight on 10 days notice, and I understand that it is a huge deal when you take a fight on short notice, but he did get knocked out in the first round, so I imagine it did have some kind of effect on him. But at the end of the day, if a wrestler is knocking you out with a head kick in the first round, there really isn't that many excuses you can come up with. So then we get to their third title fights, which is Khabib versus Gaethje and obviously Islam versus Dustin, which hasn't happened yet. But Khabib beat a Gaethje who was interim champ, who had just shut down Tony, Cowboy, and Barboza, and Justin's fight with Tony was an insane performance, and comparing that to current Dustin, he's had everything he had going into the Khabib fight, plus beating a prime Dan Hooker, 2 wins against Conor, a loss to Charles, a win against Chandler, a loss to Gaethje, and a win over Saint Denis. Now, to say this version of Dustin was better than the version of Gaethje is a hard debate because Dustin is getting up there in age, and Gaethje had just taken down 12-win streak Tony, who is supposed to fight Khabib. So I do think this goes to Khabib. Granted, Islam doesn't have a spectacular knockout over Dustin, but I think to this point everyone can see with Islam's resume being covered with fun fighters, featherweights, and what would be a 35-year-old Dustin, Khabib would still beat him out because Khabib fought Gaethje, who had just beat one of the lightweight goats in Tony, so Islam would still need to do more to surpass Khabib. It's clear whoever wins at UFC 302 will be fighting Arman next, unless Islam loses a super close decision. Then I think we see that rematch, but if Islam beats an Arman that just knocked out Beneil and beat Charles, I think at that point you would start to see a significant amount of people saying Islam is better. I mean, Arman looks like one of the best fighters in the UFC right now, and I think people would jump to say Khabib never fought someone as good as Arman, but I think with Islam's resume versus Khabib's overall, you would still have to give it to Khabib because of Islam's weak run to the title and the loss. But I think what would change everything is if Islam beats Arman and Leon beats Bilal. I think Islam would move up to welterweight and take on Leon, who at that point would have beaten Usman twice, dominated Colby, and beat Bilal. At that point, if Islam were able to take down that version of Leon, it would really throw this whole debate out of order, because depending on how Leon beats Bilal, we might be looking at Leon as one of the greatest welterweights of all time. And if Islam knocks out Leon, I think it would be really clear that Islam is over Khabib. And if Islam subs him early, the same thing. But I think if Islam etches out a sketchy decision, I think there's going to be a lot of people there that are still 50-50 in the debate, and he would probably need one more defense in either weight class to turn people over. I think for me personally, a decision win for Islam, even if it's close, would put him over Khabib for me in terms of resume, and that's what makes this debate so intense. It's the fact that Khabib retired so early, and it makes it really hard to scale him in terms of all-time GOAT discussions, because from a resume perspective, it would really only take Islam 2 to 3 fights to surpass him, and it's hard to dispute Islam is over him because Khabib's resume is so thin, and I think it's really hard to say that Islam is a better fighter than Khabib because Khabib never bled in any fight, and Khabib didn't lose rounds, whereas Islam's fight with Volk was an extremely close decision against a smaller fighter, and Islam had a really weak run to the title, plus he got knocked out in the early days of his career. Khabib being as dominant as he was, and Khabib fighting more former champions on his title run, has made it clear that this is going to be an intense debate. So what do you think? And if you enjoyed this video, why don't you check out this one on why UFC champions are broke, and leave a like, subscribe, and don't forget, we're just getting started, we're gonna stay consistent, and I'll see you in the next video.